All right. So what I wanted to start with was, but in my talk, I'm gonna be referencing this project. I'll try to share out a link for everybody. It's open on GitHub. You can go do a clone and get to play with some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today. In addition to this, I'm also going to be frequently referencing the Firebase documentation. This is a great place to really get your feet wet with Firebase. They have a lot of tutorials and a lot of videos. It's all free, and it's a great place to kind of learn as you want to, expand your skill set within the platform. I'm also going to be referencing the Firebase CLI, which I have already installed on my machine, and this is fairly critical in using Firebase because the CLI does a lot of cool things for you that you would otherwise have to do yourself, basically. And so I just wanted to introduce all that before I start talking about it, so you had a basis for the terms that I'm going to be discussing. So with that, I will start the presentation. So hello, everyone. Today, as Sujith mentioned, I'm going to be discussing how to build an API with Firebase. In this presentation, I'm going to be covering what Firebase is on a high level. Firebase is very big, so I'm only going to be able to basically skim the surface of some of the really cool things that you can do. I'm also going to be covering Firebase functions, which are actually the way that you can build an API with Firebase. And so I'm going to transition from a discussion of just what functions are, show you how to build an API with them, and then I'm going to show like some basics about testing, deployment, and the next steps beyond just basically creating an app. I'm going to have a little bit of live coding to show you kind of what this experience looks like, and then I'll go over a few more advanced features and some cool projects that you could potentially dive into with Firebase. So a little intro about myself. As you just said, I was a previous colleague of his. I now work for CapTech Consulting. I'm a manager and I have 10 years of industry experience prior to that. I'm a full stack developer, but I mainly work in the front end world now, despite dabbling in back end stuff. I have a master's degree from Christopher Newport in computer science. And I also have an MBA from William & Mary. I finished the MBA that Sujith had mentioned. So, all right. And these are pictures of me, my wife, and our fur babies. So, Firebase. So what is Firebase? Firebase is a platform that provides services and tools that allow you to quickly and easily build applications. It actually was originally a startup. It was acquired by Google in 2014. And since then, they've built it out to do a lot more than actually what it originally, I think, could do. And but it's always been, you still get the same quality of service. And I've been using Firebase for about 3 years. But my understanding is that they just have a rich history of development and good quality APIs that you can use for your projects. Firebase as a platform, some of the services that they provide are a real-time database. They have web hosting. They also have an authentication service that you can drop into your client-side apps. They have the functions that we're going to mention today, and then they have a lot more, even in machine learning and AI. They provide services like that. Firebase is free, and you can try an account or create an account, and they have thresholds for payments, and I believe as a developer, it's very hard to actually reach those thresholds. I've created a large number of projects and haven't really had to pay. I don't think I've had to pay anything, or if I have had to pay anything, it's been very minimal. So it's just a great resource for people that want to learn, but it's also a great resource for people that actually want to build quality applications for clients and personal use as well. So as I mentioned, Firebase functions are the basis for the APIs that we're going to be building today. The basic premise behind Firebase functions are they're exposed REST endpoints that you can call, and you can really think of these as similar. If you're familiar with AWS, AWS Lambdas are very similar to this, and the same thing goes for Azure functions. If you've built any functions with Azure before, you can basically integrate it inside like the Firebase platform to connect back to Firebase services. Now, the other thing that I want to point out is their connection to Google Cloud Functions. So you have Firebase functions and you have Google Cloud Functions. Google Cloud Functions are built in Google Cloud, and you can use them to, manage, like, connect services and that kind of thing. But ultimately, it's an exposed place that you can call based on an event that triggers an action. And so that's kind of what you're going to see in the left picture or code snippet I have up here. In the case of Firebase, Firebase has the ability to do basically the same kind of thing as a Google Cloud function, but steering it toward Firebase services. And you can actually wrap an API in a function and expose that and treat it as truly a serverless API. So the two code snippets I have here, the one on the left is a trigger. So like this would be a Firebase function that you have base, and in this case it's using a database trigger in the Firestore database. It's a NoSQL service that Firebase offers. Basically, if you follow the code here, the Firestore, whenever a record is written to the users table, it's calling a Slack webhook and then sending back a Slack message to a team channel. This is, very common, and when you see functions within Firebase and actually Google Cloud. On the right, you see just one little, get endpoint in an Express API. This is the same thing as if you had a full-fledged Express API, this is one of the routes that I'm going to have in my sample project. But I just point out here that it's the same thing except for the fact that it's a full-fledged API. So the one on the left is a single trigger, and the one on the right is just one of many that you could build for your project. In order to do this, it's super simple. You use the CLI to basically initialize your project, and once the project is initialized, you set it up just like you would any other Express.js application. You're pulling in the functions library. You have your Express instance. You're defining your routes, and then at the bottom, if you notice on line 11, you're actually wrapping the entire Express app in a function that isn't exposed. And so, like, up to the point in this little URL of this /app, that's basically the REST endpoint that's exposed. And then beyond that, you have your different routes. So like in this case, I've only got one hello world, but if you had other routes, it would be app / whatever the route is. So just like any other Express application. And so this is really cool because with Firebase, you can build, a full-fledged Express app and then, deploy it and maintain it and do everything else with very minimal code. You don't have to worry about a server to stand up for hosting. You don't have to worry about trying to, do some kind of like Nginx, like reverse proxying or something like that. This is all done for you, which is really great. So once you've set up your Firebase function and built your API, you're going to want to test it. Firebase previously didn't have like an emulator or a way that you could really do this without pulling in a third-party library. Now, they've recently just pushed out an emulator, which allows you to essentially run a local version of your Firebase application in a test suite. And all you have to do is pull in this Firebase testing library, and then you can initialize essentially like a local version of Firebase to run your code against. And it follows the same syntax as if you had been familiar with like Mocha or like, I guess, like Jasmine testing syntax. And it's very simple to set up from there, because then you just call the whatever part of Firebase you're trying to work with, and then you call some assertions upon that. So you do the arrange, act, assert kind of model that everyone's pretty familiar with testing. Once you have built your application, once you've got your tests running, now it's time to deploy. You can deploy this directly with the Firebase CLI, and I'll show you this in the next section. It's super simple. It's amazing, really, because and just with these little commands, the Firebase CLI is packaging your application, deploying your application, setting up whatever infrastructure it needs to be able to expose that endpoint, and then feeds back to you a URL that you can interact with. But all that's done by the CLI. So it's, this is a very I remember the days of this being a very manual process, and I still think it's really cool that you can do it this way. So now that you've kind of seen a high level of what Firebase looks like, I'll talk about my sample project. So for the sample project that I'm going to walk through, I have created essentially a time clock. And so I've created rest points for clocking in, clocking out, and then, obviously getting records. I've added tests to this project that I'll show you. And then I'll also show you how the CLI basically interacts with this project and allows it to build, run, and deploy. And finally, I'm also going to be using Postman to be able to test the application both locally and in a deployed state. So let me there it is, my live coding. All right, now if I can get escape. Okay, all right, so now let's look at the app. So here's the project that I mentioned in the beginning of the talk. I'm going to go into the start folder. Well, actually, I'll pull it up with VS Code. So in the start folder, what you have here is basically the initial setup. And I'm going to go ahead and show you what the CLI looks like as if you had not done anything. So if I just go right here and I say Firebase init, there it is. So when you do Firebase init, what this is doing is it's looking at the project, and then it's going to ask you what you want to build. And if you notice, just like I said in the beginning of the slides, it's offering a database. You can set up rules for Firestore. You have functions, which is the one that we're actually going to use, but then you can also do hosting, storage, and you can use local emulators. I'm choosing functions. Then I'm going to say use an existing project, and then it's going to pull up the projects that I have, looking for time clock. There it is. So it's what it's doing is the CLI. I've already, I should also mention this, before running this, I'm logged in the CLI in this terminal session. So it's able to pull the projects out of my account, and that's how I was able to cycle through and pick a project. Firebase functions are only available in JavaScript and TypeScript at this time. If you wanted to see more about that, the docs kind of explain some of the things, but right now, those are the only options. The advantage of that, though, is if you have a team that has a lot of JavaScript experience or a lot of front-end experience, diving into a back end of Firebase is not that big of a lift for the team. So with the CLI here, I've picked the project, I've picked functions. I'm going to say I want to do it in JavaScript, and then I'm going to say no for ESLint, and then no for the dependencies. Okay, and then the initialization is complete. Okay, now if we go back up here, now if you look in the start folder right here, there are two files that were generated. So there's a Firebase RC and a Firebase.json. These are the files that the Firebase CLI is going to use to be able to interact with the application. You can add some additional things here, which I'll show you in just a second, that basically tell the CLI where either your project is, or if you have additional things that you want to run with the project, you would basically configure it here. If we go over into the functions folder, you notice that this functions folder was generated. And what that does is, by default, the CLI always, whenever you want to create functions, it creates a functions folder. And I think the whole idea there is that if you have a project that has a lot of other stuff, like say you have a front-end application and you want to add functions for whatever reason, it'll just package it right there in that functions folder. It makes it very simple to work with, and that's all just kind of like a byproduct of the CLI. the index file that's created here, I've actually created these endpoints, but if you hadn't done the initial setup with Express that I have here, you would just basically have a reference to Firebase functions, and then there would be one function that basically does like a hello world. What I've done here is I follow the same convention that I showed you in the slides before, where I've got essentially the setup for Express. And here I've actually set up about 5 different endpoints that are going to compose my time clock. With this built, or with this just basic setup here, you can do npm run serve. And what this will do now is, okay, what error do we have? We have start package.json. All right, so, oh, I have to go in the functions folder. Sorry, there we go. So if I'm running a npm script, it's called serve. And if you notice, this is another thing that comes directly from the CLI. There's a serve, there's a start, there's a deploy, and you can even pull logs out of the Firebase console. And this is all just scaffolded for you right directly from the CLI. So I'm running the app locally. If I pull up Postman and I go over here, and if you notice I've got environment variables in Postman, but let's switch this over to local. And if you notice the URL here, it might be hard to see over Zoom, but it says localhost 5001. That's the default port that Firebase uses. But this is essentially the base URL for the locally running app. And the CLI actually shows this to you in the terminal right here. So all this is like just directly provided for you. You know, you're just sitting there with the CLI, you've initialized your project, you've set it up, you're serving, and the CLI is telling you all of what you need to test it. So I've got these endpoints all already set up here. So I'm just going to go ahead and call one. And then I have like the hello world endpoint. I have a clock in, I have a clock out. But you see that basically, you know, these are kind of dumb endpoints because I don't have any meat to the routes. I'm just showing you that the routes can work. So now if we switch gears and I switch back, I go into the finished product, go back over here into VS Code. So if I go over into the finished product here, you'll notice that I've done a little bit more work. So like, you know, I've gone through the process of, I've set up the project, well, I've initialized it with CLI, I've set it up with the Express app code, I've built my like basic routes, and now I've added meat to the routes. And if you notice right here, these are the same routes that I was just showing you. You got the clock in, the clock out, select all, delete all, but the difference is that now they're doing stuff. But if you notice that, there we go. If you notice up here, you have all this, and you say, well, what is this? This is basically setting up permissions for your application to interact with Firebase. So because Firebase is primarily a cloud-based platform, the services have their security that you have to consider, because most of it's basically exposed URLs, and so you have to have some kind of like rules around domain usage and that kind of thing. If we go over to the Firebase console, you'll notice this is, I should have probably started with this, but this is what you see before you even really start. So you've created a Firebase account, you've created a project in Firebase, and then you're brought to this console for your project. If you go over and you see on the left-hand side here, these are all the different services that I was mentioning. You know, you've got like an authentication service, and you can configure it. You have a database service, which is what I'm going to be showcasing tonight. And then you have, you know, a file storage service, hosting, and the list goes on. All of these things have security rules associated with them. So like right here, if you look in the database, I've got a rule set here that basically says no one can access the database. The reason I do that is because now that this Firebase project is created, if I didn't have this rule and I just had like an open rule or something like that, if someone knew the URL of this database, they could hit it and do whatever they want. What Firebase encourages you to do is basically create like role-based permissions. And this is getting way beyond the scope of what I'm presenting here. But if you read into the documentation, they'll show you how you can build rules in here for specific clients or specific documents even. that you either want to be publicly accessible or you only want to be accessible to certain people. I'm locking it down because of the fact that I don't have to worry about anyone accessing this except for the API that I've built. So what I've done is I've gone over here to usage and permissions and service accounts, and I've created a private key. So what that is basically a set of what the API needs to interact with Firebase. And so like I've got the private key, I've got the auth URI, there's all the things that the API would need to interact with Firebase on an admin level. This is considered like administrator privilege. And what I've done is I built the API to have that. So that means that any of the routes that I have built, I basically can use these privileges to be able to, to do things. And in this case, I'm specifically going to be working with Firestore, which is the Firebase NoSQL database. But you could do this for any of the other services that Firebase offers. So what this code is doing in a nutshell at the top of the project is basically just setting up all of these permissions so that the app can use Firebase or can interact with Firebase. Additionally, I've pulled out an instance of the database because that's what I'm going to be interacting with in my routes. And then I've refactored all of the interaction with Firestore into this file called Firestore. And then if you notice in the routes, I'm calling the different methods from this refactored file. And so I've got like a clock in, I've got a clock out, I've got the select all. If you look over in the Firestore file, these are using the Firebase SDK to interact with the NoSQL instance of Firestore that my project's using. So like I've got database.collection. These are all API methods that are provided as part of the Firebase SDK. So with all that said, hopefully I haven't lost you yet. There we have essentially got a finished Express instance right here. And so let's see it in action. So if you go over here and I do the same thing that I did on the start folder and I say serve, this is going to run the same local copy of my API. I can go over here to Postman and I'm still local, but if I go over here to the finished endpoint, these are the same ones I did before. I call it and I say, hello world, and then like I have a clock in. Let's change the body and we'll say hello hello RVA software development group user group. There we go. All right, so now I'm doing a clock in. Now what happened here was I just got a 200, and I got a 200 because I actually did something. What did I do? Well, if you go over to the database and you look, we have a record right here. Hello, RVA Software Development User Group. Locally, I just wrote to Firebase using an API that I built. Beyond that, with these other endpoints, I can, now that I've got a clock in, I can get a clock out, and this gives me the time I was entered, and then I've got timestamps for when I was out and in, and then the actual total time, which was 27 seconds. But obviously, if you use this in the real world, it'd be a lot more time. I can select all. I think I had like some test records in here before, yeah. And then I can delete all, which I'm not going to do that because I still want to look at this data. So now you've got your API is all set up. Your API is built. You're testing it. It's looking good. It's connecting to the instance in the cloud of Firebase, and everything is looking good. But you want to build tests, and you want to build tests because you want to make your code maintainable. You want to make it easy to detect bugs and that kind of thing. And you also want to be able to just basically regression test your code if you do something and you're breaking things. So if I want to go, I can go here. I'll stop the instance of the project. If I go over here and just run test, this is running my test file with a local emulator against my project. And you see right here, I've got these 6 tests, and it's saying like enable to get a length 0, can clock out successfully, the whole 9 yards. In the code, what this looks like is, I've got my little test script. I'm starting the Firebase emulator, and then I'm running Mocha against the instance of the emulator. And over here in the test file, I'm doing just what you would do with any Express app that you want to test using, Mocha and Chai and all the, traditional test libraries. I set up basically the instances of all of those libraries. I have a setup function here, which creates the local copy of Firebase for me to run against. And then I'm following the standard Mocha syntax where I've got like a before, I have a describe block, I have an it block, and then I get, I've got like some basic tests, and then I get like more complicated here where I actually do the operations in the on my API, and then I'm running some assertions. And again, this is the arrange, act, assert kind of model that you would follow with these kind of things. So so that's testing. So now we've got the project set up, we have tests set up, we've been able to test it locally, looking great, but we want to deploy it. So in that case, what you do is you just go over here and say npm run deploy. And so now what is this doing? So what this is doing is it's building the project, packaging it, and then shipping it out to Google Cloud, or really Firebase. But Firebase is basically sits on top of Google Cloud. And I'll show you that in just a second. This part usually takes like a minute to 2 minutes. I also wanted to highlight something that I mentioned briefly before, where when I initialize these projects, you notice it says Firebase RC and Firebase JSON. These are the two files that the CLI creates. If you notice in Firebase JSON, I've got some extra information here. This is basically saying to the CLI, I've got functions, but they're in the root directory. So that means I don't have to use that functions folder anymore that was present when we did the start project over here. Additionally, I've got some information about emulators, and I needed that because I use the emulators for testing. So I've got those basically defined. If we go back to the CLI, deploy was successful, and if you notice here, it's telling you what it's doing. So it's saying that it required making sure the APIs are set up or initialized for the project. You've got it's preparing the directory, it's packaging it, it's uploaded the package, then it's updating the actual function itself, and then at the end it gives you a link to the console. So let's go right there. So if you go over to the console, this is the Firebase console for the application that we're working with here, the API. If I go over here to the functions area, you'll notice that there's only one function. The reason that is because the Express API that I've built is being wrapped by this function. So all these little routes that I just showed you, where I was clocking in and clocking out and selecting data, all that's wrapped in this little app. But the cool part is that all of this there's logs for all of this. So even though you only see the one base endpoint here, you can come back here and it's really good for debugging, or you can add additional log statements and get kind of verbose. And you notice here, like, it's authenticated. So there's like a log for that. It's showing that I was status at 200. I don't think I have anything with like a status of anything other than a success. When I was playing with this, setting this up for the talk, I had a couple of failures I could have shown. But all that to be said, they have like some basically analytic data that you can use for this project that you set up there. But then in the dashboard, if you go over here and you say detailed usage statistics, if you notice, it actually takes you to Google Cloud. So this is what I've been saying the whole time. Firebase is really great because it connects back to Google Cloud, but it doesn't force you to learn Google Cloud. All you really have to know is how to interact with the Firebase console, and it's doing all this other work for you. So in this case, you notice that I've got a time clock project, and then it's got information about the app. And in this case, looks like it doesn't have any information because I think it's newly deployed. So I think if I go over here and I switch over to deployed, and let me see if I just go ahead and clock in real quick. I'm assuming this will, if I refresh, this should show again an invocation of No, okay, well, never mind. I think there's like a lag when you actually initially deploy and then metrics are actually shown. But if I go over here to 12 hours, you can see, yeah. So this is like stuff that you can see from the last couple of days as I was playing with this, getting ready for the talk. But anyway, I don't really want to go into all the details here because I feel like this is probably going to lose everybody. But like I just wanted to show how Firebase, the Google Cloud Functions connect back to the Firebase functions. So so that's pretty much it. Like from here, you basically have you know you can do anything you want. You know, you can go out and I could add, you know, another endpoint that I want to add. I could you know, test something locally. I could integrate some of the other services. The really cool part, like I said, is that the documentation here provides references and guides for pretty much all of the things that you would need in your day-to-day work as a developer, and even if you just want to, you know, dive in for fun. You know, like if this has got some information on creating a Firebase project, showing you how you can initialize Firebase in your app. It's going over the same permission stuff that I was just talking about. I also wanted to point to, I'll also share this, but I wanted to point to a blog post I wrote. So I wrote a post on Medium some time ago that basically has a more detailed version of what I've just described. This is actually just building I think it's like a to-do app, but it kind of just it goes all the way from not knowing anything about APIs to being a full-fledged, you know, Firebase user, project user, whatever you want to call it. But the great part about this is that there's a large community around this platform. The documentation is easy to digest, and again, it really does provide a lot of services that you as a developer would have to do a lot of work to really get into. When you think about the fact that they've got like an authentication service built right into your project, normally you would have to, you know, you could use Google Authenticate or whatever. You could also use like Auth0 or one of these other companies that provides JWT tokens, but all of that work is done right for you. And that's one of the really cool and really powerful features of this. The only other thing that I also would say is that because it uses Express.js as essentially the server platform to build your you know, node backend, you get all the greatness that comes out of those. So like if you have some advanced routing you want to do, if you want to add middleware for whatever reason, you know, all of that comes right with it. And all you have to do is essentially orchestrate, you know, the app in the way that I've just shown you here. And then, you know, you can start building and running, you know, pretty quick. So with that said, I think I guess we should open it up to questions. Is there anything else that I should say before we go to questions, Sujith?
No, that was great. Yeah, so yeah, I guess you can like just ask Andrew any questions that you may have. I don't see anything in the chat, so feel free to just ask questions. So just to kick it off, Andrew, like what are the typical use cases that that you see for for the Firebase platform? Like what are some examples of things that have been done in the real world that we can talk about?
Sure. So I just had one actually with a client recently. We had a situation where we had a front end and a back end team, and basically the back end team was a little bit behind on some of the APIs that we were trying to consume, and I used Firebase to create a mock server. I basically just created a couple of different endpoints. I matched the request and response objects to what the backend team was telling us. And our group was able to proceed with our work without really having to stop. And we were able to, like, you know, essentially mock, you know, what would become the API that we were going to consume. That was a really practical, like super simple use case. We were up and running in probably about 24 hours because it took us, you know, we had to coordinate a little bit. I also had to get information about the back end, but we were able to get up and running. A little bit more beefy use case or like enterprise-based use case. You can get into like, I guess, like machine learning or like doing like some data intensive tasks. You know, the Firebase documentation and, like, you know, they've got some different videos and tutorials on it. The whole idea is that you can run your code in infrastructure that you don't actually have to manage. So you could set up some kind of like data intensive application and let Google run it instead of like you having to do it like on your on-prem service. One of the ones that let me go back and I'll share my screen again. One of the ones that I've seen a lot of people do with Firebase that isn't even actually an API is just to use the functions for triggers or data, like, you know, essentially for like database triggers based on, you know, events in your application. If you go over to, this is a project I built a long time ago. I think it still has, here it is. If I go over here to functions, this is actually the function that I was sharing in my slide. We had a slide. This project is it's just a small app that basically creates a way to gamify learning. The whole idea is you have users and the users can share what they're learning and you get points for certain tasks. But I wanted Slack, we had a Slack channel that we'd integrated with this project, and I wanted the Slack channel to be updated whenever things happen. So I created a function here that listens for when new users are added, and then it would send a Slack message. Same thing for whenever someone would create an activity, we had an activities channel. And then finally, this is kind of a cool example because I have two Firebase functions that are just freestanding functions, and then I actually have a wrapped instance of Express to send an email. So this actually is using both at the same time. But basically, in a greater sense, the use cases are really all over the place. I've mainly used it for lightweight tasks because most of the clients that I work with are, you know, like government or, you know, private businesses that already have infrastructure in place for AWS or Azure or something like that. And so they don't really have they're not really as in tune to Google, I guess. But I have seen quite a few use cases for basically enterprise apps that leverage these services to provide value for a private company or even like a, you know, like a nonprofit entity or something like that. But in all cases, the whole premise is that you would use these for basically for triggers or for event driven activities. And then if you really wanted to, it has the flexibility and the scalability to build out a full-fledged API, just like what we went over tonight.
Awesome. So do we have any questions?
Oh, I got a comment in the comment channel. It looks like it's very, it's Sinshad Demir just said that thank you for presenting. It's very helpful technology, specifically for small mobile development. I've used it with Flutter to build a mobile app and it was really great. That's a totally, I'm so glad that Sinshad brought that up. Flutter is a great use case for Firebase. Firebase they have like a lot of really great support in the mobile world. And what I showed tonight was primarily like a web app or a Node, you know, backend. But there is a whole plethora of things that you can do with the mobile space with Firebase. And I highly recommend, you know, just looking at some of the tutorials and really getting into it because it's a very easy platform to get up and running with.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I've seen a lot of the stuff that's available on the internet. Like it's basically about mobile apps. So it looks like if you're trying to quickly like rig up a mobile app, especially on the Android platform, that Firebase would be a great starting point. All right. Any other questions?
Andrew, developer, like
You're getting a lot of.
Hello, Yolita.
Sounds like somebody wanted to say something, but looks like we got a lot of feedback. Maybe try again.
Andrew, this Nick Coach. I'm not a developer, but I like to I work with developers. I like to know a little bit about the tools that are used. I had not seen this before, so that got my interest. Is there, what I'm curious about are there any other tools that are in the same class as this that you would compare to it that might be used the same way?
Sure. Yeah. That's a great question. As far as like a comparable platform or tool set, I would say that I think Azure has a fair amount of, actually, oh, I shouldn't say that. Azure does have, they've got things around like machine learning, and then they did some stuff with like bots, like the botnet or bot framework, I think is what they call it. But AWS actually, let me go back and I'll share my screen again. AWS just came out with a thing called Amplify, which is very similar in the idea behind, wait, does this work? Oh, it is, okay. All right, so if we go over to AWS Amplify, so there's this thing called the Amplify framework, which basically has the same kind of tooling set. If you go, I really wish they had better links over here. Let me see if I can try here. So basically the whole idea is that they have like a CLI that runs. It allows you to quickly stand up services within like the AWS like sphere of tools and that kind of thing. But the idea is that it takes away a lot of the manual work. And I know, just like you were saying, you know, there are a lot of folks out there that are just like yourself, Nicholas, where you have people, you know, you're working with developers, but you want to learn about the tools, but you maybe don't necessarily have all the time to get into the nitty gritty of how it all works. But it would be really great to have something that kind of like shows you the experience, or at least, you know, on a high level, lets you kind of play a little bit. And the Amplify framework is a great example. This is, I think it's open source. I tried to do, they had a problem with a thing that was with Angular a long time ago. I actually tried to do no PR, got shut down, but it's kind of funny. But like this is another example of basically the same thing, and this is obviously specific to AWS. Azure, I'm not as familiar with, so like I'm still learning a little bit. But I think the Azure Bot Framework has like something like this, where there's like a orchestrated setup. But I think that's also specific for like chat bots and that kind of thing.
All right, nice, Andrew. Yeah, I would imagine I'll probably encounter this Amplify at some point, I would imagine. And we'll see you on Firebase. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. If you have any other questions, you know, feel free to ping me. You can find me on LinkedIn, and you can also find me on Twitter. And you know, I'm more than willing to help if you have any needs or questions.
Much appreciated.
Yeah, so this whole concept of like being able to kind of use like you know, it's like platform as a service, right? So they're basically providing pretty much everything you would ever need to build an app and like deploy it to the world and like have people use it. So I think that's becoming very, very common across all the cloud providers. So Google obviously has Firebase, and AWS Amplify, and I'm sure Azure has its own thing. If not, they will be providing that pretty soon. So I think that's a really good development in general for proof of concepts, startups, but even the big companies, like the big enterprises, are actually interested in this because it allows them the freedom to quickly like build and deploy something, especially like kind of the COVID-19 situation, for example. If you had to respond really quickly within a matter of weeks, these platforms are actually great starting points. So you don't really have to build out a full platform on your own data, like on your own data centers or whatnot. But so it's becoming more popular, and I think increasingly a lot of solutions will be, at least they will start on these platforms. Eventually they may get, you know, when they get really of a sufficient scale, they may not be able to be supported by these platforms. But at least in the beginning, I see a lot of opportunity for people to get started.
Yeah, I would, just building off what you just said, I think that's a great summary of basically this platform. I am kind of like I like to tinker, I guess is the easiest way to explain it. And I build a lot of stuff all the time. And Firebase is great because like you said, you can get up and running, you know, you can just try something out. If it doesn't work, then it's okay. But I will say that, like I said, you know, before, I've built kind of like, they're still like small apps, but full-fledged like applications that could have scaled to enterprise level. And it does seem to lend itself to providing that kind of a service. I think the biggest thing is that most of the time your big companies and your big you know, corporate entities base a lot of their service architecture around established you know, like accounts, or you know, they've already got like several MySQL instances that they're trying to connect directly to through some kind of customized platform. And so it's not, you don't see it there. You don't see this there as much because you have a lot of that traditional architecture that's kind of been grandfathered in as we've developed.
So from a performance standpoint, does this have limitations you bump up against?
Not so far. Not, I haven't. So the one thing I will say is you have to, like, they have this thing called pay as you go. So after you do your first application, you usually end up having to connect like a credit card or something to it, because the free, like truly free things without a card, you only have like, I think it's like 5 requests or something like that. But then when you connect a credit card to it, it's still free. Like they have like a free tier, but they force you to do that so that I think after you get to a certain point, it directly bills, and that's their whole thing. But the point is that they're very conscious of budget, and you know, that definitely that was the only thing that I've really come across. And the reason I bring that up is because I didn't realize when I was first learning about all this stuff, I didn't realize that you had to connect you know, like a paid account to it. And I spent like probably about 2 hours trying to debug an API I was playing with, thinking that there was some kind of problem. And I finally looked in the logs, which is really where I should have started. And I found that in the message, it said, you have to enable billing for this account now that you've exceeded, you know, X number of requests. So yeah, so that was a thing. But like, to your point, I haven't seen really anything. I did a project when I was in the MBA program that I think they were testing it, and I think it ran across some kind of threshold, but it's all basically leveraging Google Cloud. So just like what I was saying before, whatever limitations Google Cloud has is kind of what you're going to see with this.